World Deadliest Inmates Food. Worst Prison Food. Africa's Prisons. Survival over nutrition in Africa's most notorious prisons. Food is not simply bad, it is an act of survival. Across Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and beyond, inmates face a brutal reality that goes far beyond confinement. Hunger here is not a consequence of punishment, it is the punishment itself. Meals arrive late, in small portions, and often carry the smell of decay. In some facilities, prisoners survive on little more than porridge and water, while in others, the food is so foul that inmates would rather starve than eat. The continent's prisons are haunted by the same ghosts: corruption, overcrowding, and neglect, and food lies at the center of it all. In Nigeria, home to one of Africa's largest prison populations, thousands of men and women are detained in facilities built decades ago for a fraction of their current capacity. At Kirikiri Maximum Security Prison in Lagos, over 3,000 inmates share space meant for fewer than 1,000. The government allocates less than $1 per prisoner each day for meals. Former wardens have admitted that food funds are routinely siphoned off by corrupt officials. The result is a steady diet of watery beans, dry cassava, and spoiled rice. Inmates describe the same monotonous routine: one bowl of beans at dawn, another in the evening, and sometimes nothing in between. A former Kirikiri inmate recalled his first meal vividly. "They gave us a bowl of beans," he said. "It had flies in it and the water was black. You had to eat fast before the maggots floated to the top." His words echoed countless others. Some prisoners pick insects from their food before eating. Others trade soap or cigarettes to buy smuggled bread from guards. Those with families who can visit survive a little better. Those without often fade away, their bones showing through the thin prison uniforms. At Kano Central Prison in northern Nigeria, religious groups occasionally deliver food to supplement government rations. On those days, inmates celebrate as though it were a holiday. But when supplies run out, they return to bowls of cold maize gruel, served without spoons or plates. The food is dumped directly into their hands or onto sheets of old newspaper. Disease spreads quickly in such conditions. Typhoid and dysentery are common, and medical care is scarce. Further south, in South Africa's Pollsmoor prison, hunger takes on a different form, one shaped by bureaucracy and neglect. Pollsmoor was once described by Nelson Mandela as a place of darkness, where humanity is tested. Designed to hold 3,000 people, it now houses more than 8,000. The kitchen, built in the 1950s, runs 24 hours a day but still cannot meet demand. Meals are rationed by the spoonful. Breakfast is porridge made from maize meal, served lukewarm. Lunch might be lentil stew or watery cabbage. Dinner is often a repetition of lunch, with less flavor and more salt. Inmates at Pollsmoor have written letters to human rights organizations describing bread with worms and soup that smells like sewage. In 2017, the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services reported that the prison's food failed to meet basic nutritional standards. Inspectors found meat so spoiled that even staff refused to eat it. Yet the report also noted a strange paradox. While some inmates starved, others grew obese from a diet heavy in starch and fat but lacking vitamins. Malnutrition and obesity coexist, two sides of the same neglect. In Kenya, the pattern repeats. The country's prisons are relics of British colonial rule, built for control rather than rehabilitation. Kamatai Maximum Prison, outside Nairobi, is infamous for its harsh conditions. Here, prisoners rise before dawn to line up for breakfast, if it comes. The morning meal is a thin porridge called uji, made from maize flour and water. Lunch, when served, is boiled beans with pebbles still inside. Dinner is ugali, a stiff maize paste, sometimes with a spoonful of greens. The portions are so small that inmates often fight for leftovers. Guards watch from a distance, indifferent to the chaos. Those who work in the prison farms are supposed to receive extra rations, but corruption ensures they rarely do. Instead, food meant for inmates is often sold in local markets by prison officers. Former prisoners have testified that they recognize their own beans, stamped with prison logos, being sold outside the gate. Inside, they went hungry. Health workers who visit these prisons describe an epidemic of malnutrition. Skin diseases, tooth loss, and anemia are common. In women's facilities, pregnant inmates often miscarry from lack of nourishment. Some babies born in prison die within weeks. Mothers are forced to feed their infants with diluted porridge, their own bodies too weak to produce milk. When asked about these deaths, officials blame natural causes. In Uganda, food deprivation has become a tool for discipline. At Luzira Maximum Security Prison, inmates who disobey orders or protest conditions are sent to isolation cells where they receive half rations for weeks. They call it the hunger cell, one former inmate said. You eat once a day, and they make sure it's something you can barely swallow. The goal, he explained, is not to kill but to break the will. Across the continent, family support is the thin line between survival and starvation. In Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya, families are allowed to bring food during visit. Mothers, wives, and children arrive carrying bowls of rice, yams, and soup wrapped in plastic. They wait in long lines under the sun, hoping the guards will let the food through. Sometimes it does. Other times, guards demand bribes or confiscate it outright. When that happens, families cry outside the gates, knowing their loved ones will go hungry again. The inequality between prisoners is stark. Those with money or external connections can bribe guards for better meals, extra bread, or bottled water. Others form alliances for survival, pooling what little they have. A handful of sugar or salt can mean the difference between weakness and strength. Inmates who cannot afford to eat often rely on faith. Only God feeds me, one man said from his cell in Port Harcourt. When he forgets, I sleep. International human rights groups have repeatedly called on African governments to reform prison diets, arguing that starvation undermines any claim to justice. But progress is slow. Funding is limited and public sympathy is scarce. Many citizens believe that prisoners deserve their fate. Politicians echo the sentiment, using tough on crime rhetoric to win votes. The result is a continent where prisons continue to operate as forgotten colonies of suffering, hidden in plain sight. Some nations, however, have begun to change. In Rwanda, the government launched a program allowing inmates to grow their own food on prison farms, producing maize, beans, and vegetables. The results were promising: violence dropped and nutrition improved. In Ethiopia, a pilot project introduced kitchen gardens in women's prisons, teaching inmates to cultivate spinach and cabbage for personal consumption. But these examples remain exceptions in a landscape dominated by neglect. Religious charities and NGOs provide small relief where governments fail. Organizations like Justice Defenders, Prison Fellowship International, and Amnesty Africa deliver food packages and hygiene kits to inmates during major holidays. But even these gestures cannot fill the gap left by systemic decay. The scale of hunger is too vast, and the political will too weak. The consequences of hunger in African prisons extend far beyond their walls. Malnourished inmates emerge sicker and weaker, carrying diseases back to their communities. Some die shortly after release, their immune systems destroyed by years of deprivation. Others struggle with psychological scars. The memory of hunger, once learned, never leaves. Former prisoners speak of hoarding food, eating in secret, or waking in the night to check if meals are still available. Hunger rewires the mind. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Africa's prison food crisis is how normalized it has become. Within bureaucratic reports, hunger is reduced to statistics, caloric shortfalls, nutritional challenges. These words disguise the reality of human suffering. They turn starvation into data, stripping away faces, names, and voices. Yet behind every statistic is a man trembling with weakness, a woman praying for a meal, a child born into hunger behind walls. In the end, the food in African prisons tells a story older than independence itself, a story of inequality carried forward by corruption and silence. The same systems that once profited from forced labor now profit from neglect. Food is both a memory of oppression and a measure of how little has changed. For those trapped inside, each day begins with the same question, not how long they will serve, but whether they will eat. Inmates count their blessings not by freedom but by spoons. When food finally arrives, thin, cold, tasteless, it is consumed in seconds before someone stronger can take it away. Then the waiting begins again. Hunger becomes prayer, prayer becomes hope, and hope becomes the only meal guaranteed. In these prisons, survival is not about justice, law, or reform. It is about endurance, the will to live on crumbs until the system remembers that even the condemned still need to eat. Sources: Human Rights Watch 2021, Amnesty International 2022, Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services South Africa 2021, Nigerian Correctional Service Reports 2020, Justice Defenders 2023, BBC Africa 2019, The Guardian Nigeria 2022. Next is Asia's prisons. Control through hunger. Across Asia, prison food tells a story of power, of states that believe hunger is a tool for obedience. From the massive prison complexes of China to the overcrowded jails of the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia, food is more than sustenance. It is a silent instrument of discipline, control, and punishment. Here, a meal is not a right, it is a reminder of submission. In these prisons, the line between survival and starvation is drawn by bureaucracy, fear, and the will of the guards. In China, the world's most secretive penal system feeds over 1 million inmates every day, including political prisoners, activists, and ordinary criminals. Officially, the government insists that prisoners receive balanced, nutritious meals. But accounts from former inmates, especially from Xinjiang's re-education camps and provincial prisons, tell another story. Meals often consist of watery rice gruel in the morning, a bowl of boiled cabbage at noon, and rice with a trace of meat in the evening, if the guards are satisfied with behavior. Inmates who disobey or fail to meet work quotas are punished with reduced rations, sometimes half portions or none at all. One former detainee described her experience in an interview with the BBC. "We were given one steamed bun for the whole day. If you didn't finish your assigned labor, they took it away." She recalled people collapsing from exhaustion, their bodies too weak to work, while guards shouted that hunger makes you obedient. Food deprivation here was not a side effect of mismanagement, it was a calculated method of re-education. China's system of prison labor compounds the cruelty. Inmates produce everything from textiles to electronics, often working 12 hours or more. Those who fail to meet quotas lose their meals or are forced to eat spoiled leftovers. Protein is rare, vegetables are rotten, and drinking water often comes from untreated tap. Diseases like scurvy and beriberi, caused by vitamin deficiency, still appear in facilities that claim to be modern. To complain is to risk solitary confinement, where food portions shrink even further. In Thailand, where over 280,000 inmates cram into prisons built for less than half that number, the situation is equally dire. The average daily food budget per inmate is around 50 Thai baht, just over $1 US. Breakfast is usually thin rice porridge. Lunch and dinner are rice with a ladle of soup or curry made from vegetables and bones. Meat is scarce and often spoiled. In the humid heat, kitchens struggle to preserve ingredients. The stench of rotten fish sauce and sour rice lingers through the corridors. Thai inmates say the smell of the food alone can trigger nausea. "We eat to live, not because we're hungry," one prisoner told a local journalist. You close your nose and swallow fast. Those with money in their commissary accounts can buy instant noodles or canned sardines, but the poor must depend entirely on the state. The result is a cruel hierarchy: one group eats, the other endures. In the Philippines, the problem is magnified by corruption and chaos. The country's jails are among the most overcrowded in the world. In Manila City Jail, designed for 1,100 inmates but housing over 4,500, prisoners sleep sitting up and eat in shifts because there is no space. Their meals, called luga, consist of watery rice and bits of dried fish. When supplies run low, guards cut portions without warning. Some inmates have gone days on nothing but salt water. A report by Rappler in 2021 revealed that prison officials often pocket funds meant for food, falsifying invoices to hide shortages. Inmates caught complaining are beaten or transferred. To survive, they form networks to share what little they have. Families bring food during visits, but even that is taxed. Guards demand bribes to allow packages inside. A family unable to pay must watch their loved ones starve. In Indonesia, where prisons operate on minimal budgets, food is often outsourced to contractors who deliver the cheapest ingredients available. Rice dominates every meal, occasionally mixed with soy sauce and fried vegetables. Meat is reserved for special holidays. In Jakarta's Sippenang prison, inmates say their daily meals smell of mold. One former prisoner recalled scraping green fungus off his rice before eating. If you throw it away, you go hungry, he said. If you eat it, you get sick. Illness spreads rapidly in such conditions. Malnutrition weakens immune systems, making tuberculosis, hepatitis, and other diseases harder to control. When prisoners fall ill, they are rarely given proper treatment. Instead, they are told to rest and pray. Hunger and disease become twin punishments, reinforcing the idea that pain is part of correction. Japan stands as a rare exception in Asia's prison landscape, but even there, food is used as a tool of control. Japanese prisons are known for their strict routines and emphasis on discipline. Meals are balanced and portioned precisely: rice, soup, fish, vegetables, but everything is tasteless, unseasoned, and standardized. Inmates eat in silence, seated in rigid formation. Conversation is forbidden. Every movement is monitored. The food may not cause illness, but it serves the same purpose as hunger elsewhere: to erase individuality. The meal becomes a ritual of conformity, where flavor gives way to obedience. In India, the diversity of the prison system mirrors the diversity of the country itself. Some states provide decent meals, while others descend into chaos. In Tihar Jail, one of Asia's largest prison complexes, inmates prepare food for thousands each day. Though the official menu includes rice, dal, and vegetables, reports from former inmates reveal frequent shortages and contamination. In smaller state prisons, meals are even worse: unhygienic kitchens, insect-infested grains, and food stored without refrigeration. Religious and caste discrimination sometimes determines what a prisoner eats. Dalits and minority inmates report being served leftovers or denied portions entirely. During festivals like Ramadan or Diwali, the prison kitchens run thin, forcing inmates to ration what little remains. Hunger becomes political, a reflection of social hierarchies that follow prisoners even behind bars. Across Asia, the link between food and power is unmistakable. Guards control the meal schedule with military precision. A delay in lunch or dinner is not just logistical, it is punishment. In some prisons, officials use meal timing to break hunger strikes. In others, they deliberately serve cold or spoiled food to remind inmates of their place. Hunger becomes a language, and every tray delivered is a sentence written in silence. What unites these countries is not culture or cuisine but the shared belief that prisoners deserve only enough to survive. Governments justify it as efficiency, Society sees it as justice. But hunger, once weaponized, does more than punish, it dehumanizes. It teaches both the jailer and the jailed that suffering is normal. And once normalized, it spreads beyond the bars. Yet, amid the deprivation, acts of humanity persist. In the Philippines, inmates at New Bilibid prison have created small gardens to grow vegetables for themselves and others. In Thailand, Buddhist monks occasionally deliver donated meals, offering brief moments of compassion. In Indonesia, Christian groups send food parcels during Easter and Christmas. These moments may be small, but in a world built on hunger, they taste like freedom. Asia's prison food crisis is not about poverty alone, it is about philosophy. It reflects how governments see their citizens and how they define punishment. A meal is not just a physical necessity, it is a statement of value. When states feed prisoners with rot and call it justice, they reveal more about their own character than about the crimes of those they confine. Behind the walls of these vast and hidden institutions, hunger reigns quietly. The rice may be endless, but the nourishment is gone. The soup may be hot, but the compassion is cold. Every bite swallowed in silence is a reminder that in these prisons, reform is a word, but control is the law. And so, as night falls over the cell blocks of Bangkok, Manila, Beijing, and Jakarta, the clatter of empty bowls echoes through the darkness. Men and women lie awake, counting hours not by clocks but by hunger pains. Their sentences are measured not in years but in meals denied. Hunger, in these prisons, is the truest form of captivity, a cage within a cage, one that even freedom may never fully open. Sources: BBC Asia 2022, Human Rights Watch 2021, Amnesty International 2020, Rappler Philippines 2021, The Guardian 2022, Judicial Watch Thailand 2020, Asia Pacific Prison Reports 2023. Next is solitary confinement and food deprivation. The silent torture. In every corner of the world, solitary confinement stands as the harshest form of legal isolation, a cell within a cell, designed not just to contain the body but to erase the mind. For the men and women who endure it, food becomes the only connection left between themselves and the outside world. 3 trays a day, or sometimes fewer, are the only signs that life continues beyond the walls. Yet even that link is often used as a weapon. In solitary, hunger is no accident. It is strategy. The modern practice of solitary confinement was born from a philosophy of reform. In the early 19th century, prison architects believed that isolation and silence would lead inmates toward repentance. They called it penitence, from which the word penitentiary emerged. But in reality, isolation bred madness, and food deprivation soon became a means of discipline within the discipline. Today, that same logic persists under new names: administrative segregation, disciplinary housing, special management units. The language changed, but the hunger remained. Inside ADX Florence in Colorado, the most secure prison in the United States, inmates spend 23 hours a day alone in cells the size of a parking space. Meals are passed through a narrow slot in the steel door, often without a word. A few inches of light reach the tray, then darkness swallows it again. Former prisoners describe the sound of that slot as both comfort and torment, the only reminder that time still moves. When guards are displeased, they delay the meal or serve it cold. On bad days, they replace it with a loaf. The Nutraloaf, a tasteless blend of leftovers baked into a dense block. In some supermax prisons, hunger is written into policy. Regulations allow for modified rations during disciplinary periods, a euphemism that conceals the brutality beneath. Prisoners who protest or refuse orders may receive only 2 meals a day or reduced calorie trays. The justification is always security. But in truth, the hunger is meant to humble. The mind weakens before the body does, and obedience follows soon after. The effect is psychological as much as physical. In solitary, the body's relationship with food changes completely. Without human contact, every meal becomes ritual, a mark of survival in a place where everything else has been stripped away. Some inmates hoard crumbs, arranging them in patterns or counting them as days. Others refuse to eat at all, staging hunger strikes as the only form of protest left. The body becomes both weapon and message. Across the Atlantic, similar scenes unfold in the isolation wings of Britain's Belmarsh prison, France's Fleury-Mérogis, and Russia's Black Dolphin prison. The conditions differ in detail, but the principle remains the same. Food defines control. Inmates report being fed at irregular intervals to disorient their sense of time. In some European facilities, meals are served in silence so absolute that prisoners say they can hear their own heartbeat. One former inmate in France described it as eating inside a grave. In Russia, solitary confinement takes on an especially brutal character. Known as shizo cells, these punishment blocks are small, dark, and freezing. Inmates sleep on wooden boards and receive one meal a day, thin soup and a crust of bread. The deprivation is deliberate. Officials call it correctional fasting. The goal is to remind prisoners that comfort belongs to the obedient. Some die of pneumonia or starvation before their isolation terms end. Others survive but emerge skeletal and haunted. In Turkey, hunger has long been tied to political resistance. During the 1980s and 1990s, political prisoners launched hunger strikes to protest solitary confinement and torture. Many died. The tradition continues today, especially in high-security, F-type prisons, where inmates spend years in near-total isolation. Authorities respond by withholding food further, creating a cycle of starvation and suppression. Each side uses hunger as language, one to demand dignity, the other to deny it. Even in countries that claim to have abolished solitary confinement, it persists under different names. In Egypt's Tora prison, activists and journalists have described prolonged isolation, where lights remain on 24 hours a day and food arrives once daily, barely edible. Inmates lose track of days. They eat only to keep their hearts beating, not out of appetite. Hunger becomes a clock, the only rhythm left in a place without time. The human brain is not built for such deprivation. Psychologists have found that long-term isolation alters appetite regulation, leading to disordered eating. Some prisoners lose hunger entirely, others binge when food appears, terrified it will vanish again. Starvation becomes both punishment and adaptation. A former inmate of Pelican Bay State Prison in California described hallucinating about meals he'd never had. "I'd smell roast chicken," he said, "and cry because I knew it wasn't real." Solitary confinement also turns guards into gatekeepers of humanity. A simple act, deciding when and how someone eats, becomes a test of power. Some guards exercise that power mercilessly, cutting portions or tossing food on the floor to assert control. Others show small mercy, sneaking an extra slice of bread or allowing warm meals. In such an environment, kindness feels like rebellion. Medical experts have long condemned the practice. The World Health Organization and United Nations classify prolonged solitary confinement, over 15 days, as a form of torture. Yet thousands around the world remain in such conditions for years. In the United States alone, more than 60,000 people live in isolation on any given day. In China, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, the numbers are unknown, hidden behind censorship. Wherever it exists, the hunger looks the same: thin bodies, hollow eyes, and food that no longer resembles food. The few who leave solitary often describe lasting damage. Their sense of taste dulls, their digestion fails, and their relationship with food never recovers. Some eat compulsively, others can barely swallow. The mind associates nourishment with control, and that connection becomes impossible to break. In this way, the punishment follows them home, invisible but permanent. Still, resistance finds its way even here. Across the decades, prisoners have used hunger strikes as their final voice. From the suffragettes of early 1900s Britain to Irish Republican prisoners like Bobby Sands in the 1980s, hunger has been both plea and protest. To starve oneself is to reclaim the only power the state cannot fully take, the decision over one's own body. The strikes in modern prisons, from California to Cairo, continue that legacy, demanding recognition through suffering. The tragedy is that most hunger strikes end in silence. Authorities force-feed inmates through nasal tubes, framing it as medical necessity. The tubes cut the throat, the food burns going down. The protester lives, but his voice dies. International law calls forced feeding a violation of human rights when done against one's will, but it continues in secrecy across continents. In the end, both the protester and the system are consumed by the same hunger, one for freedom, the other for control. The cruelty of solitary confinement lies not in what it takes away but in what it replaces. It strips away the world and replaces it with routine, control, and hunger. The human body, denied company and flavor, begins to fold inward. A tray of cold rice becomes the only evidence that someone, somewhere, still knows you exist. And yet even that connection is conditional, subject to the moods of unseen hands. For those who have lived through it, the sound of a food slot opening never leaves the mind. It is the click of survival, the whisper of captivity, the punctuation of endless silence. Each clatter of the tray reminds them of two unchanging truths, that hunger is the most obedient prisoner, and that the taste of freedom, once lost, can never be fully recovered. Solitary confinement turns food into language, a vocabulary of cruelty written in portions and temperature. To understand what it means to eat there is to understand the quiet horror of being alive but unseen, fed but unfed, sustained but not nourished. The hunger is not just of the stomach, it is of the soul. And for many, it never ends, even long after the cell door finally opens. Sources: United Nations Human Rights Council 2022, Human Rights Watch 2021, Amnesty International 2020, The Marshall Project 2019, BBC World Service 2022, World Health Organization Prison Health Report 2021, ACLU Solitary Study 2020. Where Food Becomes Reform. The Scandinavian Model. In the frozen silence of Northern Europe, the idea of prison takes on a very different meaning. Inside the minimalist walls of Norway's Halden prison, the clang of metal doors is replaced by the hum of conversation and the smell of fresh bread baking in the kitchen. There are no maggot-filled trays, no punishment loaves, no starvation used as control. Here, food is not a weapon, it is a bridge. The Scandinavian model begins with a simple but radical belief. Rehabilitation starts with dignity, and dignity begins with what people eat. Halden, often called the world's most humane maximum security prison, houses some of Norway's most serious offenders: murderers, drug traffickers, and repeat criminals. Yet inside, they live nothing like the inmates of Angola, Brazil, or ADX Florence. Meals are cooked in communal kitchens shared among small groups of prisoners. Ingredients come from local market. Men and women chop vegetables, fry salmon, bake loaves of bread, and sit down together to eat at the same table. Guards often join them. The rule is simple. Everyone here is treated as human, because one day everyone here will return to society. Norway's approach was born from the ashes of war and reflection. In the 1970s, after decades of punitive incarceration, the Norwegian government began asking a difficult question: what if punishment made people worse instead of better? The answer came through reform. The country reduced sentence lengths, emphasized education, and redesigned its prisons to mimic normal life. The philosophy became known as the principle of normality. The more normal a prisoner's daily life, the easier their reintegration into society. Food, once a symbol of control, became a cornerstone of that normality. Each inmate at Halden receives a weekly food allowance, about 400 Norwegian kroner, to plan and prepare meals. They shop at the prison grocery, write menus, and take turns cooking for one another. The meals resemble those of an ordinary Norwegian household: roasted chicken, rice, fish stew, potatoes, vegetables, and dessert on weekends. For birthdays or holidays, prisoners are allowed to bake cakes or cook traditional dishes. They eat from ceramic plates with metal utensils, a quiet but powerful reminder that they are still people, not property. Psychologists who study Halden's system say that the impact of this approach is profound. Shared meals create community and accountability. Cooking requires cooperation and patience, skills vital for life after release. Nutrition improves mental stability and reduces aggression. Inmates who once lived by violence learn to handle knives for cooking without conflict. The simple act of eating together becomes therapy. Norway's prison food policy has drawn both praise and outrage. Critics from other nations often mock it as too soft, arguing that criminals should suffer, not dine. But the results speak louder than rhetoric. Norway's recidivism rate, the percentage of prisoners who reoffend, is among the lowest in the world, hovering around 20%, compared to over 60% in the United States. The difference, officials say, lies not in leniency but in logic. "We don't want our inmates to become better criminals," one warden explained. "We want them to become better neighbors." The idea has spread beyond Norway. In Sweden's Österåker prison, inmates eat buffet-style meals prepared by fellow prisoners enrolled in culinary training programs. The kitchens function as classrooms, teaching not just recipes but responsibility. Many graduates go on to work in restaurants after release. In Finland, prison farms and bakeries supply food to both inmates and local communities, creating a sense of contribution rather than isolation. Food, once used to dehumanize, now becomes a way to rebuild identity. A Finnish inmate once described the difference with quiet pride. "We work, we eat, we talk," he said. "It feels like life again. When I leave here, I know how to live without crime." His words capture the heart of the Scandinavian philosophy, that justice is not revenge but restoration. Contrast that with the imagery from Brazil, Africa, or the United States: maggots in rice, punishment loaves, and starvation as policy, and the transformation feels revolutionary. In Norway, the kitchen is the center of reform. At Bastøy prison, located on a small island in the Oslofjord, inmates farm the land themselves. They raise cattle, harvest vegetables, and bake bread in wood-fired ovens. The food they grow feeds the entire community. Guards and inmates dine together in a shared hall overlooking the sea. There are no fences, no barbed wire, only trust and accountability. When the prison's governor, Arne Kvernvik Nilsen, was asked whether the system was too lenient, he replied, "Punishment is the deprivation of freedom. Nothing more. Everything else we do should prepare them to return to society." That belief is reflected in every meal served. At Bastøy, no one goes hungry. Food is balanced, nutritional, and communal, reflecting the values the system hopes to instill. The science supports the philosophy. Studies by the Norwegian Correctional Service show that inmates with access to quality food and shared meal routines exhibit lower levels of violence, depression, and relapse. Nutrition affects brain chemistry. Proper diets stabilize mood, enhance cognition, and reduce impulsive behavior. In short, feeding people well makes them calmer, healthier, and more rational. The findings are so consistent that even some American and British prisons have begun experimenting with improved food programs inspired by the Nordic model. Still, reform faces resistance. In many countries, the idea of feeding prisoners well collides with public anger. People equate harsh conditions with justice, forgetting that most inmates will one day return home. In the words of a Swedish prison warden, when society feeds its prisoners with cruelty, it must later dine on the consequences. Norway's critics often ask how a murderer or violent offender deserves home-cooked meals and grocery allowances. The answer lies in perspective. To Norwegians, justice is not about vengeance, it is about protection. And protection comes not from starving a man, but from teaching him never to harm again. In a world obsessed with punishment, the Scandinavian model stands as quiet defiance. The food is not fancy, it's simple, healthy, and shared, but it represents something profound: trust. The act of cooking together in confinement is a rehearsal for freedom. It reminds both guard and prisoner that the wall between them is temporary, that both are part of the same moral community. Reform through food may seem small, but it challenges centuries of cruelty. It replaces starvation with empathy, punishment with preparation. In a Halden kitchen, a prisoner chopping onions for dinner is already learning discipline, timing, and teamwork, the same skills he'll need in any job outside. He eats what he cooked, thanks those who helped, and cleans his plate. These simple gestures, repeated daily, become acts of re-education more powerful than any lecture or sermon. At its core, the Scandinavian approach recognizes a truth long ignored by much of the world. People change not through pain but through purpose. A hungry man thinks only of survival, a nourished man begins to think of his future. That difference defines whether prisons breed monsters or citizens. As one Norwegian inmate once said, reflecting on his time at Halden, "They fed me like a human, and somehow I started to feel like one again." In those words lies the essence of reform, the belief that even the worst among us can recover dignity, if only given the chance. Where other prisons serve fear, Halden serves food. And in that meal lies the quiet promise of a second life. Sources: Norwegian Correctional Service 2022, Ministry of Justice and Public Security of Norway 2021, BBC Nordic Reports 2020, The Guardian 2022, Human Rights Watch Europe 2020, University of Oslo Criminology Studies 2021. Justice on a Tray. What prison food reveals about U.S. The story of prison food is not truly about what happens behind walls. It is about what those walls say about us. Every nation, every era, and every system of justice has revealed itself in what it feeds its prisoners. From the rotten beans of Brazil to the shared tables of Norway, food inside prisons reflects the moral temperature of society outside them. It tells us whether justice is guided by vengeance or by conscience. In the end, the meals served in darkness reveal more about the light, or absence of it, within us all. In the beginning, punishment was about the body. The whip, the chain, the cell, all were designed to remind offenders of pain. But as the world claimed to grow more civilized, that physical cruelty moved underground. Modern prisons were supposed to represent progress. No more torture chambers, no public executions. Yet the cruelty never vanished, it simply changed flavor. The meal tray became the new stage of control. Hunger replaced the lash. Indifference became policy. In America, the richest country on earth, millions of trays filled with processed starch, gray meat, and spoiled milk roll through prison corridors every day. Each one costs less than $1. Each one tells a story of how far efficiency has replaced empathy. Politicians call it fiscal discipline, taxpayers call it justice. But the truth is simpler and darker. To feed someone poorly is to remind them they are unworthy of care. And when a nation accepts that logic behind bars, it eventually learns to accept it beyond them. In Africa and Latin America, where overcrowded prisons overflow with the poor, the meal has become the final instrument of social inequality. The rich buy comfort even inside the cell, while the poor fight over scraps. Inmates who once struggled to eat on the streets now face the same hunger behind bars, only worse, because here they cannot even beg. Their food reflects the same hierarchy that placed them there in the first place. The spoon becomes the last dividing line between privilege and despair. In Asia, the lesson takes another form: order above all. Food is rationed not only by portion but by obedience. The prisoner who submits eats, the one who resists starves. Meals are a language of silence, delivered with precision and emptiness. When food becomes a tool for control, even flavor turns political. The bland rice of conformity replaces the spice of individuality. In Europe's far north, by contrast, the meal becomes redemption. The shared table in Norway, Sweden, and Finland stands as an act of defiance against centuries of cruelty. It is proof that punishment can coexist with compassion, that strength can exist without humiliation. In these places, the state does not fear feeding its prisoners well. It fears what happens if it forgets how to feed them at all. The difference is not wealth or culture, it is philosophy. Where others see criminals, Scandinavia sees citizens in pause. Psychologists who study incarceration have long argued that food is the most intimate form of power. It enters the body, shapes mood, and defines memory. Deny a person flavor long enough, and they forget pleasure. Deny them warmth, and they forget comfort. In prisons, that denial becomes identity. When a person eats only what disgusts them, day after day, they internalize the message that they deserve disgust. Reform becomes impossible because shame consumes the appetite for change. But food can also heal. In facilities that have dared to reimagine their kitchens, violence drops, cooperation rises, and inmates begin to see themselves not as enemies of society but as participants in it. In these rare spaces, cooking replaces conflict. Prisoners who once fought over crumbs now compete for recipes. The smell of real food, garlic, bread, onions sizzling in a pan, fills the corridors, washing away years of decay. The act of preparing a meal becomes a rehearsal for normal life, a whisper of what awaits beyond the walls. Still, most of the world clings to the old logic, that to feed the guilty with dignity is to insult the innocent. This belief ignores a fundamental truth: most prisoners will one day return home. They will sit at kitchen tables, raise children, and share meals again. The hunger they experienced behind bars does not vanish when the gate opens. It lingers, shaping their trust, their health, their sense of belonging. A system that feeds people with cruelty releases them, carrying that cruelty forward. Consider the ripple effect. A man starved in solitary confinement learns to see food as power, not nourishment. When he returns to the outside world, he brings that lesson with him. A society that starves him in prison cannot be surprised when he hungers for control outside it. Punishment without compassion breeds only bitterness, and bitterness feeds violence. In this way, bad food perpetuates the very cycle it was meant to break. Meanwhile, the world's best prison systems prove the opposite. Where inmates are treated as future neighbors rather than perpetual enemies, recidivism drops. The dinner table becomes an instrument of peace. In Norway's Halden prison, guards and inmates dine side by side. In Denmark's Sobisegard, inmates run a restaurant open to the public. These are not acts of leniency, they are acts of foresight. They acknowledge that the goal of justice is not to destroy, but to rebuild. There is an unspoken question beneath every prison meal: what kind of society are we feeding? Each nation answers in its own way. America answers with punishment, Brazil with neglect, China with obedience, Norway with trust. The tray itself becomes a mirror, and what it reflects is uncomfortable. The truth is that the food we serve to the condemned reveals what we believe about mercy. When meals are used to humiliate, they teach hatred. When they are used to nurture, they teach humanity. The choice between those two outcomes rests not with the prisoners, but with those who feed them. In that choice lies the measure of civilization. Justice is often portrayed as a blind woman holding scales, but perhaps it is better imagined as a cook holding a ladle, measuring portions, ensuring balance, deciding who receives warmth and who receives cold. The ethics of punishment are written less in law books than in kitchens. The moral test of any justice system begins not with the courtroom, but with the cafeteria. And so, when we ask what prison food means, the answer is simple and uncomfortable. It means us. It means our tolerance for suffering, our definition of fairness, our capacity for forgiveness. Every rotten tray served in silence is a piece of that answer. Every warm meal shared in dignity is another. In the end, a meal is never just a meal. It is history, policy, and morality condensed into one act. The same spoon that feeds can also degrade. The same bread that nourishes can also condemn. What we choose to place on those trays is what we choose to believe about justice itself. For the prisoners of Angola, Pelican Bay, Sao Paulo, and Curiciri, food remains the most tangible form of punishment they know. For the men of Halden and Bastoe, it has become the first taste of redemption. Between those two plates lies the entire spectrum of humanity's struggle to decide what justice really means. When the tray slides through the door, whether it carries despair or hope, it tells the truth more honestly than any government report or courtroom speech ever could. Justice, in the end, may not be written in statutes, it may be served, one meal at a time. Sources: Human Rights Watch 2021, The Marshall Project 2020, Amnesty International Global Reports 2022, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime 2023, BBC World Service 2022, Norwegian Correctional Service 2022, The Guardian 2023.